Alexander Carter stopped walking. The powerful Mafia boss stood frozen in the dark hallway of his own mansion, staring into the kitchen as if he had just witnessed something impossible. Because the quiet maid who worked in his house was dancing, barefoot, alone. At midnight, soft music floated from a phone resting on the kitchen counter. The melody was gentle, emotional, the kind of song that carried memories inside it. And Sophia Williams moved with it. Her eyes were closed. Her arms lifted slowly as she spun across the polished marble floor like someone standing on a stage instead of inside the private kitchen of one of the most feared men in New York. Alexander didn't move. He simply watched. The Carter mansion was a place where laughter rarely existed. The walls had heard too many tense negotiations, too many threats whispered behind closed doors. Joy did not belong here. But somehow, at midnight, this woman had brought it into the house. Sophia turned again, the faint music guiding her steps. There was something unusual about the way she moved. Grace, control, emotion. Alexander had seen many people in his life. Politicians, criminals, business tycoons, performers hired for exclusive events. But people who moved like that did not end up working as maids. Sophia laughed softly after missing a step. The sound echoed through the quiet kitchen. Alexander felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. He had lived in this mansion for years, but he had never heard anyone laugh like that inside it. Sophia didn't know she had an audience. To her, the mansion was asleep. The guards outside, the staff in their quarters, the powerful man who owned the house. All of them, she believed, were resting. So she danced freely. The music swelled slightly as the chorus began. Sophia stepped forward and raised her arms again. Her body moved with the rhythm as if every note carried meaning only she understood. But then the music ended. The sudden silence filled the kitchen. Sophia opened her eyes slowly. The smile on her face faded as quickly as it had appeared. Reality returned. She reached for her phone and stopped the music. The dancer disappeared. The maid returned. Sophia sighed quietly and picked up a dishcloth from the counter. In seconds, she was wiping the kitchen surfaces again as if nothing had happened. As if she had never been dancing at all. As if that moment of freedom had never existed. Alexander stepped back into the darkness of the hallway before she could turn around. He moved silently down the corridor. But the image stayed in his mind. The quiet maid. The midnight dance. The strange sadness behind her movements. Something about it didn't make sense. People didn't move like that without a past. Without a story. Alexander reached the end of the hallway and stopped walking. For a moment he simply stood there, thinking. Then he spoke calmly. Daniel. A tall man stepped forward from the shadows near the staircase. Daniel Brooks, Alexander's head of security. Yes, boss. Alexander's voice remained quiet. There's a maid in this house. Daniel raised an eyebrow. There are several. Alexander looked back toward the dark kitchen hallway. Sophia Williams. Daniel nodded slowly. What about her? Alexander turned back toward him. I want everything. Daniel frowned slightly. Everything. Alexander's expression remained unreadable. Where she's from. Who she knows. What she did before she came here. Daniel studied his boss carefully. Alexander Carter rarely showed interest in anyone outside his business world. Especially not the household staff. But something about tonight had clearly changed that. Daniel nodded. I'll start the investigation in the morning. Alexander looked once more toward the kitchen. The lights inside were now off. Sophia had already gone back to her quarters. But the memory of what he had seen remained clear. The quiet maid who danced like she belonged on a stage. And Alexander Carter had spent enough years studying people to recognize one thing immediately. Sophia Williams was hiding something. And before the week was over, he intended to find out exactly what it was. Alexander Carter did not believe in coincidences. In his world, everything had a reason. Every move. Every betrayal. Every secret. And the woman he had seen dancing in his kitchen the night before was hiding something. He was certain of it. Morning sunlight filled the upper floors of the Carter mansion as the house slowly came alive again. Staff members moved quietly through the halls, preparing breakfast and cleaning the rooms. To them, the mansion was simply a place of work. But to Alexander Carter, it was the center of an empire. From inside his office on the top floor, the powerful Mafia boss stood beside the tall window overlooking New York City. Below him, the city moved like a restless machine. Cars flowing through the streets. People rushing between buildings. Millions of lives moving in different directions. Alexander watched it silently. But his thoughts were not on the city. They were on the quiet maid who had danced in his kitchen at midnight. A soft knock came at the office door. "Come in." Daniel Brooks stepped inside. Daniel had worked with Alexander for years and knew better than to waste words. "You asked for information," he said. Alexander turned slowly. "What did you find?" Daniel placed a folder on the desk. At first, nothing unusual. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Daniel opened the folder. Sophia Williams. 27 years old. Born in Chicago. No criminal record. No financial debt. She applied here 6 months ago. Alexander listened carefully. On the surface, it sounded completely ordinary. Too ordinary. And before that? Alexander asked. Daniel hesitated slightly. "That's where things get interesting." Alexander sat down behind the desk. "Continue." Daniel slid several printed photographs across the table. Alexander picked one up. The photo showed Sophia standing under bright stage lights with a microphone in her hand. Behind her was a crowd. Another photo showed her singing inside a small concert venue. Alexander looked up slowly. She was a performer. Daniel nodded. "A singer." Alexander leaned back in his chair. Now the dancing made sense. People who spent years performing on stage never completely lost that instinct. Even when the stage disappeared. "What happened?" Alexander asked. Daniel flipped to the next page. A name appeared across several documents. Terence Blake. Alexander studied the page carefully. "Manager?" "Yes." Daniel continued. 5 years ago, Sophia signed a management contract with Terence Blake. At the time, he was considered one of the rising managers in the music industry. Alexander remained silent. "But the contract wasn't what it appeared to be," Daniel said. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on." Daniel pointed to another document. "Ownership clauses." Alexander read the lines carefully. "Song rights. Publishing rights. Revenue control. All transferred to Terence Blake. How did she sign this?" Alexander asked. Daniel shrugged. "She trusted him." Alexander closed the file halfway. "And when she realized the truth?" Daniel sighed. "Too late." Terence Blake already controlled most of her music. When Sophia tried to challenge the agreement, she faced a legal wall she couldn't break. Terence had better lawyers. More money. More influence. She lost everything, Daniel finished. Alexander said nothing for a long moment. He turned another page in the file. Old articles from music blogs appeared. Rising singer Sophia Williams disappears from music scene. Manager Terence Blake takes control of artist catalog. Alexander closed the folder slowly. So he destroyed her career. Daniel nodded. "Yes." The room grew quiet. Outside the window, New York continued moving like nothing had changed. But inside the office, Alexander Carter was beginning to understand the truth. The maid in his house had once stood on stages, sang for crowds, chased a dream that someone else had stolen. Daniel leaned slightly against the desk. "There's more." Alexander looked up. "What?" Daniel handed him another report. Terence Blake just released a new album through another artist. Alexander glanced at the page. Streaming numbers. Music charts. Millions of plays. Daniel tapped the title of the song. "Recognize anything?" Alexander scanned the lyrics printed below the article. His expression darkened. "These are her lyrics." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's what it looks like." Terence Blake hadn't just destroyed her career. He was still using her work. Alexander stood up from his chair. The movement was slow, deliberate. Dangerous. Daniel watched him carefully. "Want me to dig deeper?" he asked. Alexander walked back toward the window. "No." Daniel frowned. No. Alexander looked out at the city again. I've seen enough. Daniel waited. Because when Alexander Carter said those words, something usually followed. Alexander finally spoke. Keep watching Terence Blake. Daniel crossed his arms. You planning something? Alexander's voice remained calm. Not yet. But the truth was already forming in his mind. The girl who danced alone in his kitchen had lost everything because of one man. And Alexander Carter had just discovered that man's name. Terence Blake. And sooner or later, their paths were going to cross. The Carter mansion looked very different on nights when Alexander Carter hosted business dinners. Normally the house was quiet, almost peaceful despite the power it represented. Staff members moved quietly through the halls, security monitored the grounds, and the massive building stood like a silent fortress overlooking the city. But tonight, the mansion was alive. Luxury cars rolled slowly through the iron gates at the front entrance. Expensive headlights cut through the darkness as drivers stepped out to open doors for powerful guests. Men in tailored suits entered the mansion one after another. Investors, corporate executives, partners in Alexander Carter's expanding empire. Inside the dining hall, everything had been prepared perfectly. A long mahogany table stretched across the center of the room beneath a massive crystal chandelier. Crystal glasses sparkled in the soft light while silver cutlery rested beside carefully arranged plates. Every detail had been planned. Because dinners like this were not simply social events. They were negotiations, power displays, moments where alliances were formed and broken. And Alexander Carter always controlled the room. Sophia Williams stood near the side of the dining hall with the other staff members. Her posture was calm and professional, just like always. She carried a silver tray with several wine glasses, waiting for the signal to begin serving. From the outside, she looked like she belonged there, another quiet employee doing her job. But inside, Sophia still felt the same distance she always had in this house. She avoided drawing attention, avoided speaking unless necessary. The less people noticed her, the easier life became. Tonight would be no different. Or so she thought. Moments later, the doors opened. Alexander Carter entered the dining hall. Conversations paused instantly. It always happened when he entered a room. The tall Mafia boss walked toward the table with calm confidence, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit. His expression remained controlled, unreadable. But his presence filled the room. Every guest greeted him respectfully. Mr. Carter. Good to see you again. Alexander nodded politely to each one. Then he took his seat at the head of the table. The dinner began. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere slowly relaxed. Wine glasses were refilled. Business discussions mixed with casual conversation. Sophia moved quietly around the table with the other staff members, serving drinks and replacing dishes when needed. Most guests barely noticed her. To them, the staff were invisible. But one guest noticed. His name was Victor Langford, a wealthy investor known for his arrogance. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair as Sophia approached with a bottle of wine. He watched her carefully. "Hey," he said suddenly. Sophia stopped politely. "Yes, sir." Victor smirked. "You work here full-time?" Sophia nodded. "Yes, sir." Victor studied her with open curiosity. "Well," he said casually, "that's surprising." Sophia waited patiently. Victor gestured lazily with his glass. "A girl like you shouldn't be serving drinks." A few men at the table chuckled quietly. Sophia kept her voice calm. "Would you like more wine, sir?" Victor ignored the question. "You ever thought about doing something else?" The room grew slightly quieter. Sophia maintained her professional expression. "I'm happy with my work here." Victor laughed softly. "Really?" He leaned forward slightly. "Because if you ever get tired of washing dishes, I'm sure someone could find a better use for you." The meaning behind his words was clear. The laughter around the table faded quickly. Sophia felt heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm just here to do my job," she said quietly. Victor shrugged. "Shame." The sound of a fork touching the table interrupted the moment. It was quiet. But in the silent dining room, it sounded louder than a gunshot. Alexander Carter had stopped eating. The entire table fell silent. Alexander slowly set his fork down beside his plate. Then he looked directly at Victor Langford. His voice was calm, but cold enough to freeze the room. "Mr. Langford." Victor blinked. "Yes." Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. "My staff are not part of tonight's entertainment." The silence that followed was heavy. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Oh, I was only joking." Alexander's expression didn't change. "I don't recall inviting jokes about my employees." Victor looked around the table, realizing no one was supporting him. No offense meant. Alexander held his gaze for a moment longer. Then he spoke quietly. "Good." The tension lingered for several seconds. Finally Alexander looked toward Sophia. "You may continue." Sophia nodded slightly. "Yes, sir." She poured the wine and stepped away from the table. Victor said nothing else for the rest of the dinner. The conversation slowly resumed, but the mood had changed. Everyone in the room had understood something important. Alexander Carter had just drawn a line, and no one present intended to cross it again. Later that night, after the guest had left, the mansion returned to its quiet state. Sophia stood alone in the kitchen finishing the final dishes from the dinner. The events of the evening replayed in her mind. Victor's words, the uncomfortable silence, and Alexander Carter defending her in front of the entire table. She still didn't understand it. People like Alexander Carter rarely noticed people like her. Yet tonight, he had. Sophia dried her hands and turned off the kitchen lights. As she walked down the hallway toward the staff quarters, she didn't notice someone standing in the shadows near the staircase. Alexander Carter, watching quietly, because the more he learned about Sophia Williams, the more certain he became. The quiet maid working in his mansion had once lived a very different life. And sooner or later, that past was going to return. 3 days passed after the dinner. Inside the Carter mansion, life returned to its usual rhythm. Staff members moved quietly through the hallways, completing their duties with practiced efficiency. Security guards monitored the property from the control room. Expensive cars continued arriving and leaving as Alexander Carter's business world carried on. To most people, the mansion was simply a workplace. But for Sophia Williams, it had become a place where she could hide. Hide from the life she once had. Hide from the dream that had once meant everything to her. She had spent years convincing herself that the past no longer mattered, that the music industry was simply a chapter that had ended. But sometimes, the past refused to stay buried. That afternoon, Sophia was finishing her duties in one of the upstairs guest rooms. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting warm light across the polished wooden floor. Sophia adjusted the final pillow on the bed before stepping back to examine the room. Perfect. She quietly closed the door behind her and walked toward the small staff lounge down the hallway. It was her short break before returning to work. Inside the lounge, the room was empty. Sophia sat near the window with a cup of tea and pulled out her phone. Normally she avoided music news and social media. Too many memories lived there. But today curiosity won. A notification appeared from an old music blog she used to follow years ago. At first she ignored it. Then she saw the headline. And her heart suddenly stopped. Terence Blake's new artist tops music charts with breakout hit. Sophia stared at the screen. The name Terence Blake still carried a strange weight in her chest. Even after all these years. Slowly, she opened the article. The page loaded. A photo of a young singer filled the screen, the newest artist under Terence Blake's management. Below it was a music player. Sophia hesitated before pressing play. Part of her already knew she shouldn't. But she needed to hear it. The song began. Soft piano notes filled the room. For the first few seconds, nothing felt unusual. Then the chorus arrived. Sophia froze. Her hands started trembling. No. The lyrics. The melody. Every single word. She knew them. Because she had written them. Years ago. Late nights inside a tiny apartment in Chicago. She had poured her heart into that song. Every emotion. Every memory. Every piece of herself. And now, someone else was singing it. Sophia quickly paused the music. Her breathing grew uneven. "That's my song," she whispered. She scrolled through the article again. The song had already gained millions of streams. Critics praised Terence Blake for discovering another talented artist. His name appeared everywhere in the article. But Sophia's name was nowhere. Just like before. Memories rushed back faster than she could stop them. The recording studio. Terence Blake shaking her hand the first day they met. His promises. "You're going to be huge," he had told her. "You just need the right management." Sophia had believed him. She was young, excited, desperate for a chance. She signed the contract without understanding what it truly meant. By the time she realized the truth, it was too late. Terence Blake owned everything. Her songs, her recordings, her future. When she tried to fight him, his lawyers crushed her. She didn't have the money to continue the battle. And slowly, her dream disappeared. Sophia placed the phone down on the table. Her hands were still shaking. The staff lounge suddenly felt smaller. The walls closer. For years she had tried to forget that part of her life. Working as a maid had given her something simple. A quiet life. No expectations. No spotlight. No painful reminders. But hearing her own song again, and knowing someone else was performing it, reopened every wound she had tried to bury. Sophia leaned forward, pressing her hands against her face. "I can't fight him," she whispered to herself. She already knew how that battle ended. Terence Blake had money, power, connections in the industry. Sophia had none of those things. The world had already chosen who to believe. And it wasn't her. That evening, Sophia returned to work in the mansion kitchen. She washed dishes quietly while the other staff members finished preparing dinner. No one noticed the sadness behind her eyes. To them, Sophia Williams was simply the quiet maid who rarely spoke. But inside her mind, the music kept playing. Her music. Stolen again. Across the mansion, Alexander Carter sat in his office reviewing several documents. Daniel Brooks entered the room with a tablet. "Something interesting just happened," Daniel said. Alexander looked up. "What is it?" Daniel placed the tablet on the desk. Terence Blake released a new hit song. Alexander studied the screen. The music article appeared. Streaming numbers. Charts. Millions of plays. Daniel tapped the lyrics displayed below the article. "Sound familiar?" Alexander read the lines carefully. His expression slowly darkened. "Yes." Daniel crossed his arms. "That's Sophia's work." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "So he's still stealing from her?" Daniel nodded. "Looks that way." Alexander said nothing for a long moment. Then he closed the tablet slowly. The room fell silent. Finally, he spoke. "Daniel." "Yes." "Find the best entertainment lawyers in the country." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "For Sophia?" Alexander's voice remained calm. "Yes." Daniel studied him carefully. Terence Blake had powerful connections in the music industry. Taking him down wouldn't be simple. But Alexander Carter didn't look concerned. "Understood," Daniel said. He turned to leave the office. But before he reached the door, Alexander spoke again. "And Daniel?" Daniel stopped. "Yes." Alexander's eyes returned to the city outside the window. "Terence Blake doesn't know we're coming." Daniel smiled slightly. "That's the best kind of surprise." Meanwhile, in the kitchen downstairs, Sophia finished the last dish and turned off the lights. She walked slowly into the quiet hallway. The mansion looked peaceful, unchanged. But Sophia's world had already begun to shift again. Because somewhere inside the same house, the most powerful man in New York had just decided to go to war for her. And Terence Blake had no idea it was coming. Terence Blake had built his career on other people's dreams. For years he had moved through the music industry with confidence, presenting himself as a powerful manager who could turn unknown artists into stars. Record labels trusted him. Young singers wanted to sign with him. Music journalists praised his ability to discover talent. But behind that reputation was a man who understood exactly how to manipulate the system. Carefully written contracts. Ownership clauses buried deep in legal language. Artists who believed they were signing management deals, only to realize too late they had signed their futures away. Terence Blake knew the business. And so far, the business had protected him. That evening in Manhattan, Terence sat comfortably in his office overlooking the city. A glass of expensive whiskey rested in his hand as he scrolled through the latest music charts on his tablet. His newest project was performing even better than expected. The song had already climbed into the top streaming rankings. Millions of people were listening to it. Millions of people praising the artist. And most importantly, praising Terence Blake for discovering another star. Terence smiled to himself. "Another success," he murmured. His assistant knocked on the office door. "Come in." She stepped inside holding a folder. "Streaming numbers just updated," she said. Terence glanced at the page. The numbers were higher again. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Everything was going exactly as planned. What he didn't know was that across the city, someone had just started dismantling that success piece by piece. Inside the Carter mansion, Alexander Carter stood in his office studying several legal profiles spread across his desk. Daniel Brooks sat across from him. "You asked for the best entertainment lawyers in the country," Daniel said. Alexander looked up. "And?" Daniel slid 3 folders forward. "These are the top firms specializing in music rights disputes." Alexander opened the first folder. Inside were the profiles of attorneys who had taken on major record labels and won. "These people don't lose often," Daniel added. Alexander closed the file. "Good." Daniel watched him carefully. "You're serious about this?" Alexander leaned back in his chair. Terence Blake built his reputation by stealing from artists. Daniel nodded. "That's what the investigation shows." Alexander's voice remained calm. "He stole from the wrong person." Daniel frowned slightly. "You mean Sophia?" Alexander looked toward the window. "Yes." Daniel folded his arms. "She works here as a maid." Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead he said something simple. "She lives under my roof." Daniel understood the meaning immediately. Anyone under Alexander Carter's protection was not someone others should exploit. The next afternoon, Daniel returned with more information. "The lawyers are ready to meet," he said. Alexander glanced up from the documents on his desk. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." Alexander nodded. "Arrange it." Daniel hesitated slightly. "There's something else." Alexander waited. Daniel placed a printed article on the desk. "Terence Blake is hosting an album release party next week." Alexander read the headline. The event would be held at an exclusive rooftop venue in Manhattan. Industry executives, music journalists, producers. Nearly everyone important in the business would be there. Alexander set the article down slowly. "That's convenient." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Alexander stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city skyline. Below him, New York moved endlessly through the night. Light stretching across the horizon. Millions of people chasing their ambitions. Terence Blake believed he controlled that world. But Alexander Carter had just decided to step into it. "Daniel," Alexander said quietly. "Yes." "Let Terence enjoy his success." Daniel smiled slightly. "For now." Alexander nodded. "For now." Because very soon, Terence Blake was going to discover something important. The songs he had stolen. The career he had built on lies. The reputation he had carefully crafted. All of it was about to collapse. And it would start with one simple step. A legal challenge he would never see coming. Downstairs in the mansion kitchen, Sophia Williams finished cleaning the last dishes from dinner. The room was quiet again. The same quiet she had grown used to over the past 6 months. She dried her hands slowly and placed the final glass into the cabinet. Her phone rested on the counter nearby. The article about Terence Blake's new song was still open on the screen. She looked at it for a moment. Then she locked the phone and turned it face down. Some battles could not be won. She had learned that lesson years ago. Sophia turned off the kitchen lights and walked toward the hallway. Her shift was finally over. She didn't know that upstairs, the most powerful man in New York had just made a decision that would change her life. Because while Sophia had given up on fighting Terence Blake, Alexander Carter had just started. And Alexander Carter never lost wars he chose to fight. Terence Blake had spent years convincing the music industry that he was untouchable. He understood contracts better than most artists. He knew which lawyers to hire. And most importantly, he knew how to hide the truth behind complicated legal language. To the outside world, Terence Blake was a successful talent manager. A man who discovered rising stars. A man who knew how to create hit songs. But very few people understood how those hits were actually made. Because behind the spotlight, behind the headlines, Terence Blake built his career on the work of others. And for years, no one had managed to stop him. Late that evening, Terence sat comfortably in his Manhattan office, reviewing streaming statistics for his newest song. The numbers continued climbing. Millions of plays. Thousands of positive comments. Music critics praising the track as one of the best releases of the year. Terence leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "Looks like another hit," he said to himself. His assistant entered the room moments later. "New streaming report just came in," she said. Terence barely glanced up. "Let me guess, higher again." She nodded. "Much higher." Terence smiled. Success like this made people forget old controversies. And Terence Blake had always relied on that. But then his assistant spoke again. "There's something else." Terence looked up. "What?" "A law firm contacted the office this afternoon." Terence frowned slightly. "About what?" "They're requesting copies of your past management contracts." Terence shrugged. "That happens all the time." But the assistant hesitated. "They specifically mentioned one artist." Terence raised an eyebrow. "Who?" She checked the message again. "Sophia Williams." The room suddenly felt quieter. For a brief moment, Terence didn't move. Then he laughed lightly. "Sophia Williams hasn't been relevant for years." "That's what I thought," the assistant said. Terence waved his hand dismissively. "Send them the standard contract copy." The assistant nodded and left the room. Terence leaned back again, confident. There was nothing they could prove. The contracts were written carefully. Every clause protected him. Or at least, that's what he believed. Across the city, in a quiet conference room overlooking Central Park, a group of attorneys studied those same contracts very carefully. Several folders covered the table. Song drafts. Recording files. Contract agreements. Emails. Daniel Brooks stood beside Alexander Carter while the lawyers worked. One of the attorneys finally spoke. "We found something." Alexander looked up. "What is it?" The lawyer slid a document across the table. "This clause." Alexander read the paragraph carefully. Daniel leaned closer. "What about it?" The attorney explained calmly. "It transfers complete ownership of the artist's music to the manager indefinitely." Daniel frowned. "That sounds illegal." The lawyer nodded. "In many cases, it is." Another attorney spoke. "Especially if the artist signed the agreement without proper legal representation." Alexander closed the document slowly. "And Sophia?" The lawyer answered immediately. "She had no lawyer at the time." Daniel shook his head. "So Terence took advantage of her." "Exactly." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Alexander asked the most important question. "Can we challenge it?" The lead attorney nodded. "Yes." Daniel crossed his arms. "How long would that take?" The lawyer hesitated. "Normally, months." Alexander's voice remained calm. "You have weeks." The lawyers exchanged glances. One of them finally nodded. "We'll move as fast as possible." Alexander stood. "Good." Meanwhile, inside the Carter mansion, Sophia Williams spent the afternoon cleaning the library. The tall windows filled the room with sunlight as she dusted the shelves one by one. The mansion was quiet. Peaceful. The kind of quiet she had grown used to. For the past few years, this simple life had helped her forget the chaos of the music industry. No agents. No contracts. No broken promises. Just quiet work. And quiet nights. But the memory of hearing her stolen song earlier that week still lingered in her mind. She tried not to think about it. Tried to focus on her work. But the music refused to disappear from her thoughts. Sophia paused beside one of the shelves and sighed quietly. "Some dreams aren't meant to come back," she whispered. She believed that. Or at least, she tried to. Later that evening, Daniel returned to Alexander's office with new information. "The lawyers filed the first notice today," he said. Alexander looked up. "Already?" Daniel nodded. "They requested full documentation from Terence Blake's company." Alexander leaned back slightly. "And how did he respond?" Daniel smiled faintly. "He didn't expect it." Alexander nodded. "Good." Daniel placed another document on the desk. "There's more." Alexander glanced at the paper. "What is it?" "A legal notice." Daniel tapped the page. It forces Terence to provide every contract and recording connected to Sophia's music. Alexander studied the document carefully. That will make him nervous. Daniel folded his arms. It already has. Alexander stood and walked toward the window. Night had fallen over the city again. The skyline glittered with lights. Terence Blake was somewhere out there, celebrating another successful song, completely unaware that the foundation of that success had already begun to crack. Alexander spoke quietly. "Daniel." "Yes." "Let the lawyers keep pushing." Daniel nodded. "And when Terence realizes what's happening?" Alexander's expression remained calm. "Then the real fight begins." Because the first move had already been made. And Terence Blake was about to learn something very important. The people he had stolen from in the past were powerless. But this time, he had stolen from someone under Alexander Carter's protection. And that was a mistake he was going to regret. Terence Blake was not used to feeling nervous. For most of his career, he had been the one in control. Artists depended on him. Record labels trusted him. And contracts always protected him. But over the past 2 days, something had begun to change. It started with emails. Then phone calls. Then a legal notice. At first Terence assumed it was nothing serious. But the longer he studied the documents, the more uneasy he became. Terence sat inside his Manhattan office late that evening, reading the legal notice again. The letter came from a powerful entertainment law firm. The message was clear. They were officially challenging the ownership of several songs connected to Sophia Williams. Terence leaned back slowly in his chair. "Sophia Williams," he muttered. The name sounded distant. Irrelevant. She had been a young singer 5 years ago. Talented, yes. But inexperienced. Easy to control. Easy to convince that success required trust. And she had trusted him. That was her mistake. Terence had made sure the contracts were airtight. Or at least, that's what he believed. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." His lead attorney entered the office. Terence immediately noticed the serious expression on the man's face. "That letter you received," the lawyer said carefully. Terence waved the document dismissively. "Yes, I saw it." The lawyer sat down across from him. "You need to take it seriously." Terence frowned. "It's just a contract dispute." The lawyer shook his head. "No. It's much bigger than that." Terence leaned forward. "What do you mean?" The lawyer placed several documents on the desk. "These are copies of the evidence their legal team sent us." Terence picked up the pages. His expression slowly darkened. Early lyric drafts. Songwriting notes. Studio demo recordings. All dated before Sophia signed the management contract. "How did they get these?" Terence demanded. The lawyer sighed. "I don't know." Terence slammed the documents back onto the desk. "She doesn't have access to that material anymore." "Apparently someone does," the lawyer replied. The room fell silent. Then Terence asked the question that had been forming in his mind. "Who's backing her?" The lawyer hesitated before answering. "A very powerful client." Terence narrowed his eyes. "Who?" The lawyer finally spoke the name. "Alexander Carter." The name landed heavily in the room. Terence froze. Everyone in New York knew Alexander Carter. The man controlled one of the most powerful criminal empires in the city. And now, he was involved in this case. Terence slowly leaned back in his chair. "That explains everything." The lawyer nodded. "Yes." Terence stared at the documents again. For the first time since the legal notice arrived, he began to understand the situation. This wasn't just a contract dispute. This was a war. Across the city, the legal team hired by Alexander Carter continued working late into the night. Documents filled the conference table. The attorneys studied Terence Blake's contracts carefully. One of the lawyers finally spoke. "These clauses are extremely dangerous for him." Daniel Brooks looked up. "How dangerous?" The lawyer pointed to a specific section of the agreement. "This clause gives Terence complete control over Sophia's music indefinitely." Daniel frowned. "That's the problem." The lawyer nodded. "In many states, agreements like this are considered exploitative." Another attorney added something even more important. "If the court agrees, the contract could be invalid." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "And the songs?" The lawyer smiled slightly. "They go back to Sophia." Daniel nodded. "That's exactly what we want." Meanwhile, rumors had already begun spreading through the music industry. Music journalists were asking questions. Several producers had noticed something unusual. The song Terence Blake released earlier that week suddenly stopped appearing on certain promotional playlists. Streaming platforms were quietly reviewing the legal situation, and industry insiders began whispering about a possible lawsuit. Inside his office, Terence Blake read the latest online article. The headline made his jaw tighten. "Legal dispute emerges over hit song ownership." Terence threw the tablet onto the desk. "This is ridiculous." His assistant stood nervously near the door. "Media outlets asking for a statement." Terence rubbed his temples. "Tell them the situation is under review." "Yes, sir." But even as he spoke, Terence knew something had changed. For years he had controlled the narrative. But now, he was losing control. Back at the Carter mansion, Sophia Williams finished cleaning the dining hall late that evening. The house had already grown quiet again. Most of the staff had returned to their quarters. Sophia carried the last tray into the kitchen and placed it on the counter. She didn't notice Alexander Carter standing near the doorway, watching silently. He had been observing her carefully over the past few days, noticing small things. The way she sometimes paused when music played in the background. The way her expression changed when certain melodies reached her ears. She tried to hide it, but the pain was still there. Alexander finally spoke. "Sophia." She turned quickly. "Yes, sir." Alexander stepped into the room. "Tell me something." She waited. "Do you still sing?" Sophia hesitated. The question caught her off guard. "Not anymore," she said quietly. Alexander studied her expression. "Why?" Sophia looked down at the floor. "Because some dreams are better left in the past." Alexander didn't respond immediately, but in that moment, he became even more certain of something. Sophia Williams had been robbed of her future, and the man responsible was beginning to feel the consequences. Because while Sophia believed her dream was gone forever, the truth was something very different. The cracks in Terence Blake's empire had already started to appear, and very soon, the entire structure would collapse. Terence Blake had built his reputation carefully. For years he had controlled every situation, every negotiation, every contract. Artists trusted him. Record labels believed him. And when problems appeared, his lawyers usually made them disappear. But this situation was different. Because this time, someone powerful was pushing back. 2 days before his album release party, Terence received another legal notice. The envelope arrived early in the morning. At first he ignored it. Then he opened it. And the moment he read the first page, his confidence began to fade. Terence sat silently at his desk while the letter trembled slightly in his hands. It was no longer a request. It was a formal legal challenge. The ownership of several songs connected to Sophia Williams was now officially under investigation. Terence looked up at his assistant. "What exactly does this mean?" he asked. His assistant shifted nervously. "They're accusing you of manipulating the management contract." Terence's voice sharpened. "That contract was signed legally." "Yes," she said carefully, "but they claim it violates entertainment labor protection laws." Terence tossed the letter onto the desk. "That's ridiculous." But the assistant wasn't finished. "They also submitted evidence." Terence frowned. "What kind of evidence?" She placed a folder in front of him. "Original recordings." Terence froze. The folder contained studio demo files, song drafts, lyrics written in Sophia's handwriting, all created before she signed the management contract. Terence's jaw tightened. Those recordings weren't supposed to exist anymore. Years ago he had made sure most of them disappeared. "Where did they get this?" he demanded. "I don't know," the assistant admitted. Terence leaned back slowly in his chair. Only one conclusion made sense. Someone powerful had helped Sophia. Someone with resources. Someone with connections. Terence didn't need long to figure out who. Alexander Carter. That afternoon, the legal teams finally met. The meeting took place inside a large conference room in Manhattan. Terence Blake arrived with 2 attorneys. He walked in confidently, determined to appear calm. But the moment he saw who was sitting at the far end of the table, his expression changed. Alexander Carter, the powerful Mafia boss, sat quietly beside his legal team. Terence stopped walking for a moment. His lawyer leaned closer. "Do you know him?" the attorney whispered. Terence answered quietly, "Yes." They took their seats. The meeting began immediately. One of Alexander's lawyers spoke first. "We're here to address the ownership of several songs originally written by Sophia Williams." Terence's lawyer responded quickly. "The contract clearly transfers those rights to my client." Another attorney slid a thick folder across the table. "That depends on whether the contract is valid." Terence opened the folder. His stomach tightened. Inside were dozens of documents. Recording timestamps, draft lyrics, studio session reports, all proving the songs belonged to Sophia long before the contract was signed. Terence's lawyer studied the documents carefully. "This evidence doesn't change the legal agreement." The lead attorney shook his head calmly. "It might." He tapped a paragraph highlighted inside the contract. "This clause transfers permanent ownership of the artist's work without reasonable compensation." Terence frowned. "So?" The lawyer continued. "In several states, clauses like this can be considered exploitative." Daniel Brooks leaned slightly toward Alexander. "That's the key," he murmured. Alexander said nothing. He simply watched Terence across the table. Finally Terence spoke directly. "So this is your doing?" Alexander met his gaze calmly. "You stole from someone under my roof." Terence scoffed. "She signed the contract." Alexander's voice remained steady. "She trusted you." The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time in the meeting, Terence had no immediate response. The court hearing happened the next morning. Alexander's legal team presented their evidence clearly. The judge reviewed the contract carefully. Several clauses immediately raised concerns. Ownership transfers, revenue control, unfair leverage over the artist. Within hours, the judge made an important temporary ruling. Terence Blake was ordered to stop distributing any music connected to Sophia Williams until the legal dispute was resolved. Streaming platforms immediately removed the track from major playlists. Music blogs began publishing new headlines. Legal dispute shakes music industry. Ownership of hit song under investigation. Inside the courtroom, Terence Blake sat frozen. The first crack in his empire had officially appeared. Back at the Carter mansion later that evening, Sophia Williams had no idea what had happened. She stood in the kitchen finishing the last dishes from dinner. The mansion was quiet again. Just like every night. Sophia dried her hands and turned off the lights. As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed someone standing near the doorway. Alexander Carter. She stopped immediately. "Good evening, sir." Alexander nodded slightly. "Good evening, Sophia." She waited politely. Alexander studied her for a moment before speaking. "Tell me something." "Yes." "Do you still sing?" The question caught her off guard. "I used to." Alexander continued. "Do you still want to?" Sophia hesitated. The answer lived somewhere deep inside her. But she shook her head slowly. "That life is over." Alexander remained silent for a moment. Then he said something that made her look up again. "Not for long." Sophia frowned slightly. "I don't understand." Alexander's expression remained calm. "You will soon." Sophia didn't know what he meant. But far beyond the mansion walls, the music industry was already starting to feel the impact of the truth. Because the songs Terence Blake had stolen were no longer protected by silence. And very soon, their real owner would take them back. News travels fast in the music industry, especially when something unusual happens. Within hours of the court's temporary ruling, whispers began spreading through recording studios, record labels, and industry offices across New York and Los Angeles. A legal dispute. A stolen song. A powerful investor backing a forgotten artist. Music journalists started digging for answers. Streaming platforms quietly removed Terence Blake's newest hit from several promotional playlists. And suddenly, the man who had built his career controlling the spotlight found himself losing it. Terence Blake sat in his office staring at the latest headlines appearing on his tablet. His jaw tightened with every new article. Legal battle questions ownership of hit song. Music industry watching dispute involving Terence Blake. The situation was moving faster than he expected. Much faster. His assistant entered the room cautiously. "More media requests," she said. Terence rubbed his temples. "Tell them the case is still under review." "Yes, sir." But even as he spoke, Terence could feel something slipping away. Control. For years he had controlled the narrative. But now the narrative was turning against him. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Across the city, preparations were already underway for something far more important. Alexander Carter had reserved one of the most exclusive private performance venues in Manhattan. The stage was elegant but simple. Soft lighting illuminated the polished wooden floor. Rows of seats were arranged carefully throughout the room. But the real power of the event was not the venue. It was the guest list. Music producers, record label executives, talent scouts, industry critics, people whose decisions shaped careers. Daniel Brooks stood near the stage watching technicians adjust the lighting. "This is going to make waves," he said quietly. Alexander Carter stood beside him. "Yes." Daniel folded his arms. Half the industry accepted the invitation. Alexander looked around the room. "Good." Daniel glanced toward the empty stage. "You think she's ready?" Alexander didn't answer immediately. Because at that moment, Sophia Williams had no idea what was about to happen. Earlier that evening, Sophia had finished cleaning the dining hall and was preparing to leave the mansion. Her shift was over. She walked quietly down the hallway toward the staff quarters when Daniel approached her. "Miss Williams," he said politely. Sophia stopped. "Yes." "Mr. Carter would like to speak with you." Sophia felt a small flicker of nervousness. Alexander Carter rarely requested meetings with the staff. "Now?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "If that's all right." Sophia followed him upstairs to Alexander's office. When they entered the room, Alexander stood beside the large window overlooking the city skyline. He turned slowly as they approached. "Sophia." "Yes, sir." Alexander picked up a tablet from the desk. "There's something you should see." He handed it to her. Sophia looked down at the screen. Her eyes widened instantly. It was a news article. The headline read, "Court challenges ownership of hit song linked to Sophia Williams." Her heart began racing. She read the article quickly. Every sentence felt unreal. The legal challenge. The stolen music. The court order. And her name appearing again in the music industry after years of silence. Sophia looked up at Alexander in disbelief. I don't understand." Alexander's voice remained calm. "You wrote those songs?" "Yes." "They belong to you." Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she held the tablet. "But how is this happening?" Alexander didn't explain everything. Instead he said something simple. "You deserved the truth." Sophia felt a wave of emotion rising inside her. For years she had believed the music world had completely forgotten her. Now suddenly, everything seemed to be changing. Alexander spoke again. "There's something else." Sophia looked up. "What?" "Tomorrow night, there will be a private showcase." Sophia blinked in confusion. "A showcase?" Alexander nodded. "The audience will include several of the most influential people in the music industry." Sophia frowned. "Why are you telling me this?" Alexander held her gaze calmly. "Because you're the performer." For a moment, Sophia thought she had misunderstood him. "Me?" "Yes." Sophia shook her head slowly. "No. I can't." Alexander remained calm. "Why not?" "I haven't performed in years." "You haven't lost your voice." Sophia looked down. Fear slowly filled her chest. Standing on stage again. Facing the industry that had once rejected her. It felt impossible. "I'm not ready," she whispered. Alexander stepped closer. His voice remained steady. "You were ready the night I saw you dancing in the kitchen." Sophia's eyes widened. "You saw that?" "Yes." Her face flushed with embarrassment. "I thought I was alone." "You weren't." The room fell silent. Alexander continued. "Your music was stolen from you." Sophia nodded slowly. "But it was never truly taken away." He gestured toward the city outside the window. "Tomorrow night you take it back." Sophia felt tears forming in her eyes. The dream she had buried for years suddenly stood in front of her again. Terrifying. Unbelievable. Beautiful. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Alexander's answer was simple. Yes. The next evening, the showcase venue slowly filled with guests. Industry executives whispered to each other. Music producers took their seats. Journalists prepared their cameras. Everyone had heard the rumors. But no one knew exactly what they were about to witness. Backstage, Sophia stood quietly near the curtain. Her heart pounded in her chest. The stage lights glowed beyond the curtain. Daniel stood nearby. "Nervous?" he asked. Sophia nodded. "Terrified?" Daniel smiled slightly. "That's normal." The lights in the room dimmed. The audience fell silent. The stage manager approached. "It's time." Sophia took a deep breath. Then she stepped toward the stage. Because tonight, she was about to take back the voice that had been stolen from her. And the entire music industry was about to hear it. The room slowly fell silent. Inside the private Manhattan venue, hundreds of influential figures from the music industry sat facing the stage. Producers, record label executives, talent scouts, music journalists, people who had spent their careers discovering the next big star. Tonight, all of them had accepted an invitation from one man, Alexander Carter, and now they waited, curious to see what he had planned. Soft lights illuminated the empty stage while quiet conversations moved through the audience. No one knew exactly what was about to happen, but rumors had already begun circulating. A legal dispute, a stolen song, a forgotten artist returning. At the back of the room, Alexander Carter stood beside Daniel Brooks, observing the crowd. Daniel scanned the audience. "Almost everyone important showed up," he said quietly. Alexander nodded. "That's what I expected." Daniel crossed his arms. Terence Blake's reputation is already taking a hit. Alexander remained calm. "This will finish it." Daniel glanced toward the stage. "You think she'll go through with it?" Alexander's voice was steady. "She will." Behind the stage curtain, Sophia Williams stood alone. Her hands trembled slightly. She could hear the quiet voices of the audience waiting outside. The sound reminded her of something she hadn't felt in years. A stage. A crowd. A moment where everything depended on her voice. Her heart beat faster. Part of her wanted to run. To disappear before the curtain opened. To return to the quiet life she had built inside the Carter mansion. But another part of her remembered something stronger. The dream she had buried. The songs she had written. The life that had been stolen from her. Sophia closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Then she remembered Alexander's words. "Your music was never truly taken away." For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that might be true. The stage manager approached. "It's time." Sophia nodded. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the curtain. The moment the curtain opened, bright stage lights filled the room. For a second she froze. Hundreds of eyes were watching her. The entire music industry sitting in silence. Waiting. Sophia stepped onto the stage. The microphone stood alone in the center of the room. She walked toward it slowly. At the back of the venue, Daniel leaned slightly toward Alexander. "This is the moment." Alexander said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the stage. Sophia reached the microphone. For a moment she simply stood there. The fear was still inside her. But so was something else. Determination. The piano melody began softly. The same melody that had once been stolen from her. Sophia closed her eyes. Then she began to sing. Her voice started gently. Soft. Emotional. But with every line, it grew stronger. Years of silence melted away. The pain she had carried turned into something powerful. Every lyric carried the truth of her story. Every note filled the room with emotion. The audience sat completely still. Music producers exchanged surprised glances. Talent scouts leaned forward in their seats. This was not just a good performance. This was extraordinary. By the time Sophia reached the chorus, her voice filled the entire venue. Strong. Beautiful. Unmistakably hers. Daniel smiled slightly. She never lost it. Alexander allowed himself a small nod. No. Across the city, Terence Blake sat alone in his office watching a live stream of the event. His face had turned pale. The same song he had stolen. The same song, now under legal dispute, was being performed by the woman who had written it. And the industry was watching. Headlines began appearing online within minutes. Sophia Williams returns with stunning performance. Music industry reacts to explosive legal dispute. Terence Blake faces major ownership challenge. Terence stared at the screen in disbelief. For years he had controlled the narrative. But now, the truth was unfolding in front of everyone. And he could do nothing to stop it. Back at the venue, Sophia reached the final note of the song. Her voice echoed through the room before fading into silence. For one brief moment, the audience said nothing. Then the applause began. Slow at first. Then louder. Soon the entire room stood to its feet. Producers clapped enthusiastically. Journalists rushed to capture the moment. Music executives whispered excitedly to one another. They had just witnessed the return of a remarkable talent. Sophia stood on stage in disbelief. Tears formed in her eyes as she looked out across the crowd. The dream she thought she had lost forever was suddenly alive again. Moments later, Sophia stepped backstage. Alexander Carter waited near the curtain. She looked at him, overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. Alexander shook his head. "You don't need to." Sophia wiped the tears from her face. "You gave me my life back." Alexander's expression remained calm. "No." He paused before finishing his sentence. "You took it back yourself." Sophia smiled. For the first time in years, the future felt open again. Full of possibilities. And it had all started with something simple. A quiet night. A kitchen at midnight. A forgotten dream. And a powerful man who had quietly watched a maid dancing when she thought no one was looking. Sometimes, the smallest moments change everything.